let me invite each of the speakers. It is my pleasure introducing the first speaker, Ambassador Takeshi Akahori. He is a Deputy Director General, a Deputy Assistant Minister, Foreign Policy Bureau, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. He used to be in New York City as the political minister, permanent mission of Japan to the United Nations. Today, he's joining from Tokyo, and hope that we can hear Japan's perspective, as well as the nation-state negotiations, which the non-government folks cannot hear. Ambassador Akahori, are you ready? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Noguchi. It's a great honor to join this Keio CCRC Columbia SIPA Cyber Dialogue. Thank you for a kind introduction. I'm a member of the 6th GGE, and it was a great honor for me to participate in the consensus adoption. Of course, all the 2-year negotiation leading up to the consensus adoption of the GGE. And of course, I would like to share a lot of what really happened in behind doors, but I think I cannot do that in too much detail, but I hope that I can reveal some of what happened. I think this is a very good timing to be discussing norms of cybersecurity. And actually, there's a UN Security Council open debate going on. It'll start in a while in New York, hosted by the Prime Minister of Estonia. So this is a great period, an important period in that the OEWG report was adopted in March, and the GG report, first time in 6 years since the last version, was adopted at the end of May. Ambassador Lauber, which will join us later, I hope, but he played a very important role in achieving consensus among all UN member states in adopting the OEWG report by consensus. For those of you who aren't familiar with UN jargon, open-ended means that all the member states can participate. So the difference with the GGEs is that GGE is a group selected by the Secretary General. In the last case, it was 25 members. In the past, it used to be smaller. Some states complain that it's a selective club. That's why the OEWG was established. But perhaps I'll leave that to Ambassador Lauber. In any event, the open process did achieve in producing a consensus report. And the most important point is that it reaffirmed what was agreed by the GGE in 2013 and 2015, particularly that international law applies, including the charter, UN Charter in its entirety. But to be very frank, the GG report has much more value. For each of the 11 norms included in the 2015 GG report, the new report now gives clarifications, it explains what are expected of states, and it provides examples of implementation. For me, having participated, Norm 13C, we speak of them by numbers, is of utmost importance, but I'll explain what it's about. It's about states should not knowingly allow its territory to be used for internationally wrongful acts using ICTs. Now, because of the additional language in the new report, it is now clear that the norm concerns not only states, but acts by non-state actors from or through a state's territory. It is also now clear that a state should take appropriate and reasonable steps to address the situation if it is aware of or if it is notified of the act. Owing to this norm, a state, whether it's a perpetrator or not, cannot just say, show me the proof, I didn't do it, so leave me alone. They have to respond to requests for assistance. Norm 13F is also relevant. According to the norm, a state should not conduct or knowingly support ICT activity contrary to its obligations under international law that intentionally damages critical infrastructure or otherwise impairs the use and operation of critical infrastructure to provide services to the public. The GG has made it possible for Japan to publish its national statement on how international law applies in cyberspace. It has been provided to the Secretariat. I hope it'll be published in the weeks to come. It is available on the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs website. Our position is that there's an international law obligation of due diligence There are some countries, Anglo-Saxon countries, who do not take the same view. For states like Japan who recognize due diligence as international law, norms 13C and F, which I mentioned, are affirmation of that international law obligation. There's a ICJ case, old one, called the Corfu Channel case, and it ruled that a state should not knowingly allow its territory to be used for acts contrary to the rights of other states. So those few last words are different from the formulation of the GG report. If we had stuck to that formula in the GG report, that would have been full reaffirmation of due diligence as international law, but the language is a compromise language. By the way, the whole report is a political document, so it is not, the whole report itself is not legally binding, and it was not intended to be a legally binding treaty. So there are compromises here and there. Again, clarification on the critical infrastructure norms is also important. Examples of critical infrastructure are provided with particular emphasis on healthcare and medical infrastructure, which the group of countries, including Japan and Australia, promoted, taking into account the COVID-19 pandemic and attacks on hospitals, which are totally unacceptable. President Biden's remarks related to the ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline, Japan is following closely, and we will certainly have in-depth discussions with the US government on those remarks and what they intend to negotiate with the Russians. But I will share with you that on May 13th, President Biden said, quote, "We do not believe the Russian government was involved in this attack, but we do have strong reason to believe that criminals who did the attack are living in Russia. We are working to try to get to the place where we have a sort of an international standard that governments, knowing that criminal activities are happening from their territory, move on those criminal enterprises," unquote. Later, on June 16th, after the summit with President Putin happened, President Biden also said, quote, "I talked about the proposition that certain critical infrastructure should be off limits to attack, period, by cyber or any other means. Responsible countries need to take action against criminals who conduct ransomware activity on their territory." In the G7 also, G7 leaders agreed that Russia should respond to react to ransomware activities from their territory. So in a nutshell, President Biden seems to be urging Russia to implement the relevant GG norms of responsible state behavior. And it is also reported that he handed a list of 16 categories of critical infrastructure not to be attacked. In the case of Japan, we identify 14 categories. On international law, it is clearer now by the GG report that internationally wrongful acts attributable to a state will entail the international responsibility of a state. We published in our national paper that means that if the perpetrator state shall seize the act if it is continuing, the state shall offer appropriate assurances and guarantees of non-repetition, and the state is under an obligation to make full reparation for the injury. So that is what state responsibility means. And also, although mentioned in the GG report is very minimal, that is understood by the mention of state responsibility. Actually, one country denied that there existed customary international law on state responsibility. They mistook customary international law with a draft submitted by the International Law Commission to the UN General Assembly. It is true that that was never adopted by the General Assembly, but that for many states was sort of a crystallization or a reconfirmation of customary international law. It's not written as a treaty, but it exists. Also, the applicability of international humanitarian law is expressed in the new GG report in a rather clear manner, although it is in a negative sense. And I quote, "The group noted that international humanitarian law applies only in situations of armed conflict." Now, international humanitarian law is essentially about protecting civilians in armed conflict. Some states, or one state, argued that affirming international humanitarian law would lead to militarization of cyberspace. It's quite the contrary. And the ICRC Red Cross was very helpful in convincing middle ground countries that that statement made no sense. So we are happy, and a lot of Western countries are happy that international humanitarian law was confirmed clearly, although in the formula which I showed you in the GG report. Self-defense, from the outset, I tried to have the report spell out the word self-defense. In the 2015 report, it mentioned inherent right of states to take measures recognized in the charter. It's evident that it talks about self-defense, individual and collective, but myself and some other countries wanted to an explicit mention. We could not get it. We still don't understand why anybody would be opposed to self-defense, but my guess is that they don't want to be attacked under the pretext of self-defense. So we discussed about 11 norms, and we discussed several advances we made under the international law section. I would like to point out that this might be a little confusing when we talk about norms and international law. Norms sometimes are legally binding, but in the case of the GG reports from 2015, we talk about voluntary norms, non-legally binding. And then we also talk about international law. We should be careful because for some states, there's overlap in the two sections. So Japan would like to make clear that the 11 norms do not alter any rights and obligations under international law. This language comes from the consensus for Hitachi report. Voluntary norms may eventually evolve into customary international law if there's enough state practice and if it's confirmed by the international community that that is how they all think of it as law. And we call that opinio juris in legal terms. We don't know if it will get there, but it would be important at the least to further identify how existing international law applies. We still have a lot of ground to cover. For instance, some states do not recognize that there's a sovereignty issue. Or let's say that there's no violation of sovereignty if it does not constitute a larger, go above a higher threshold of intervention. Now, is that the case? That is to be discussed further. And in our national position paper, Japan doesn't take too strong a position. We say that sovereignty exists, violation of sovereignty exists, but we don't spell out which are the concrete examples. So we would like to discuss further first among like-minded countries. So Japan published this position. Other countries, I believe 20 or so, have submitted their position papers to the Secretariat, UN Secretariat. Hopefully it will come out in a few weeks, and those position papers will be very useful for international law scholars and international law practitioners in understanding where the public opinion, international public opinion, or the opinio juris on cyber international law exists. Let me touch upon several other points that Japan mentioned in its national position. International disputes involving cyber operations must be settled through peaceful means pursuant to Article 2.3 of the UN Charter. So peaceful settlement. Of course, that is the ideal, and that is what is required by the Charter. But Japan is of the view that when a cyber operation constitutes an armed attack under Article 51 of the Charter, states may exercise the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense recognized under the same article. So I told you that we couldn't spell out state self-defense in the GG report, but it seems to me evident to me that whether that is written or not in the GG report doesn't change that self-defense is an inherent right. Inherent right means that any state is born with that right. So it's not up to a GG report or even the UN Charter to impair that inherent right. States should respect and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms. Frankly, we would have loved to see more robust language on human rights in the GG report. This was pushed back by some authoritarian countries, but we did clearly spell out that human rights and fundamental freedoms, both online or offline, should be respected. So Japan hopes that a larger number of UN members will voluntarily publish their national positions. outside the GG 25 members. And we will continue further discussions on that. It is now time to implement the agreed norms, 2015 and 2021. And also, there's important language both in OEWG report and GG report on capacity building and confidence building. So we should also implement those. It is because of that belief that Japan is a co-sponsor of the Program of Action Initiative. Program of Action is adopting a document which details what should be done by states and then regularly follow up and monitor implementation by states. There are precedents to programs of action, including in the small arms control. And Japan played a key role in the small arms. We hope that together with France and Egypt, who are the key promoters of the program of action, Japan can contribute to the elaboration of a useful and effective program of action and help that to be a focal point of implementation in the future. But at the national level, critical infrastructure providers can be involved fully in implementation. Also, there should be legislation and policy by the governments. Japan's cybersecurity strategy is under revision now. We hope that to have the new cybersecurity strategy after the Olympic and Paralympic Games. By the way, we take those games seriously and we are preparing seriously to make sure that nothing irregular happens. The Colonial Pipeline incident reminds us of the need for every state to criminalize certain cyber activities under domestic law. That helps actually, together with international law and norms of state behavior, that helps because sometimes, as in the ransomware case, the perpetrators are criminals and they are allowed to pursue those activities, to say the least. Perhaps there's a talent manual 3.0 process going on, perhaps including practitioners in that process at a certain point might be useful. Non-state actors also could invoke norms and international law in domestic and in international courts in litigations. In certain cases, Security Council can act, and also the Secretary General can take preventive diplomacy. We hope that the combination of all those practices using norms and international law will promote shared understanding on how international law applies. Let me share with you the most recent development on public attribution by Japan. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department in April announced that it had sent an investigation report of a Chinese national to the Tokyo District Public Prosecutor's Office on the suspicion of using falsified information to rent a server, and that server was used for cyber attacks. We have identified that it is highly likely that a specific unit of the Chinese People's Liberation Army was involved in the attacks. And although not directly related to the incident, we are also aware of cyber attacks in which the specific unit of the Chinese PLA were highly likely involved. So the Chief Cabinet Secretary publicly denounced these attacks, and I myself in Japanese Parliament condemned the attacks. And I also shared in Parliament that Japan's position, strong position, has been conveyed to the Chinese government. We call this private attribution, reaching out to the suspected perpetrator. Also, last week, National Police Agency announced that they'll be creating a cyber directorate. So there are very important developments in Japan, and we would like to catch up rapidly with those countries in the lead of cybersecurity. I stop here for my initial remarks. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Akahori. So we learned quite a lot short period of time. Next, fortunate on time, I can see Ambassador Lauber's name. Ambassador Lauber, are you ready?
Yeah, I apologize for the delay. I had some other business that took much more time than expected here. Yes, apologies.
Thank you for joining. So before you joined, we talked about the appreciation that you, as a chair of the OEWG, led to the consensus of the open-ended working group, including all the member states of the UN to publish the report. And let me introduce to everybody in this room the Ambassador Lauber, His Excellency, the permanent representative of Switzerland to the United Nations in Geneva. He was a chair of open-ended working group in the field of information and the telecommunication in the context of international security, and leading the report. He is joining from Geneva, Switzerland. So Ambassador Lauber, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me today. I missed the latest presentation, so what I would suggest is that I say a few words about the open-ended working group's results with regard to norms in particular, maybe a few words on the process, although I see several very familiar faces here who've heard, who followed the process and have heard talking about the process. I apologize to them, but maybe just to try to position the process in a larger norm discussion. And then you maybe just interrupt me if I'm talking things that you all know very well anyway. But I think it's the working group was indeed significant with regard to the normative framework that rules or tries to rule the use of ICTs and their impact on peace and security. You all know that the UN has been dealing with this issue for quite some time, over the last 20 or so years, through a series of groups of governmental experts. They came up with a very smart, a very sophisticated normative framework with different pillars, existing of 11 non-legally binding norms for responsible behavior of states in cyberspace, a common understanding of the applicability of existing international law, confidence building measures, and also sort of an agreement that we need to invest in capacity building more as a preventive measure. That framework that had been developed was sort of built up until 2015. And then we had a few years of disagreement among member states. It was not it was not possible to further develop that framework until 2018, when we had two parallel decisions in the General Assembly establishing two processes to continue discussions on these issues, on the framework and a bit beyond. So we had an additional 6 GGE, and we had, for the first time, an open-ended working group. Open-ended meaning all member states of the United Nations have a possibility to participate. These processes started then seriously in 2019. The process I had the chance to lead, the open-ended working group, was supposed to finish work last year, 2020, in June. As you can imagine, like everything else, the process was disrupted by COVID. We had to change the work plan, we had to change the working methods, and we were much delayed. So instead of finishing in June, we finished this year in March. And much of our deliberations in the end were done in a virtual format. We had 2 sessions, regular sessions, meeting in New York in September 2019 and in March 2020, and then we had to switch to virtual. And when we met, some of us met in March 2020 this year in New York to conclude our work. We had a hybrid format, very complicated, and to this day I'm surprised that we were able to come to an agreement. You know, just to give you an idea, hybrid meaning meeting in 3 different conference rooms at the same time, plus people switching in virtually from Capitol. A year ago, this would not have been possible. So very, very, very interesting. Maybe a few words on what was complicated and what was positive factors that led to ultimately the success, the conclusion of the group. The mandate to begin with was pretty much what I mentioned in the beginning, were the parts of that normative framework. The group was mandated to look at these 4 elements: norms, the applicability of international law, confidence building measure, capacity building, plus to also have a discussion on the current threat assessment, the threat, how member states view the threat of ICTs for international peace and security, and the last element, regular institutional dialogue, how member states want to discuss this in the future. Ambassador Akahori mentioned the program of action as one of the possibilities. You heard probably that in the meantime, a new working group has already been decided. That was the last part. The challenge, one of the challenges of the process was precisely the new format. The fact that we now, for the first time, had all the member states being able to participate. Not all did, but a very large number did. We usually, in the meetings in New York, we had 70 plus delegations taking the floor, many more in the room. And this meant we had some delegations participating in these discussions that were very familiar. They had been in these GGEs, they had followed these discussions, they were very familiar with the issue, very familiar with that normative framework that had been developed. Others came to this new, and we had to first kind of create a level playing field, bringing everybody to a certain level of understanding what the issues were and what had happened in the past. So that was certainly one of the challenges. The other challenge, another main challenge, was, of course, that we had these competing resolutions in the beginning, meaning we had not consensus on how to go about this, to discuss it. Should it be in a GG? Should it be in an open-ended working group? But at the same time, we had the mandate to finish by consensus. So how do you bring this tension you have in the beginning together and overcome it in the end? And then the third the challenge was certainly COVID, as I mentioned, very disruptive. We had to reinvent the process, restructure the process. A few positive factors, I think, in a way, and don't get me wrong, COVID had, of course, and still has, and will have for a while, very terrible impacts. But the delay it created was probably also a positive, in a sense that we had more time for discussions, more time for precisely delegations who came to this for the first time to learn about the issues. I think it also made clearer to everybody how urgent and how important the issue was, precisely during COVID, when we all became so much more dependent on ICT, on these technologies, and also realized how vulnerable these technologies, this infrastructure was. Plus, we saw ICT attacks against science laboratories, health facilities. So I think the urgency, the awareness of the urgency increased, and as a consequence of that, the willingness to come to a conclusion, to come to a success in the end, also increased. These were some, I think, of the positive factors. Plus, and I see some of the delegations represented here in this room. We had a number of delegations who were extremely helpful, very constructive, in bringing positive ideas and resolution and proposals to the discussion. And this also, not just member states, others too. I see some think tank representatives here, very positive contributions from those, plus excellent support from the UN Secretariat. Now, what's the significance of the result? We had, in the end, we have this report with two parts, a substantive report, the part that where member states really agreed on, and then a chair's text where we put in all the elements that were discussed, the proposals, the ideas, but we didn't have agreement, not consensus on. At least we had consensus that we were able to have these two parts, which I'd like to think is already positive. On the norm side, the most important thing, and this may sound like not much, but trust me, it is. It was essentially a reconfirmation of the normative framework we had in 2015. And that was significant because, as I mentioned, we had lost consensus. After 2015, there was 3 years plus where member states were not able to agree on much. But then in this group, we were able to agree again. No, yes, this normative framework in 2015, that is still valid. And we were able to agree on it with 193 member states. With all due respect to the GGEs that did fantastic work, but they were limited to 20, 25 states. Now we have 193 saying, okay, that's the normative framework we want to respect. In this sense, I also like to believe that the success of the open-ended format was conducive to the later success, very important also, of the latest group of governmental experts. We went beyond that. It was not just a reaffirmation, where there was some new elements. There was a clearer explanation about the relationship between non-binding norms and international law, clearly stating that non-binding norms cannot replace international law. There was some elements about the threat assessments, a clear indication that member states are concerned about ICT attacks against health facilities, a reference to the need to protect critical infrastructure, although we were not able to say this word, but indirectly we refer to the fact that there is something like critical infrastructure that has to be protected. There's a strong reference, indirect, to international humanitarian law. Here again, the GGE was able to go one step further. I like to think that we were able to prepare the field for some clear recognition of the applicability of IHL by the group of governmental experts. We had some strong elements in our report on confidence building measure, including some practical proposals on how to better use lessons that are learned in one region to make it available to other regions, etc. Some very strong elements on technical cooperation capacity building, how we can improve that, how we can better match the needs and the offers that are out there. There's some reference to the gender, the digital gap, including the gender gap. And then one last point I want to mention is, I think what we also were able to do is to be inclusive beyond the member states, to give a role to civil society, not as much as we would have liked. You know that the peace and security area of international intergovernmental discussion is probably still the most sensitive, and may I even say averse against civil society implications. But I think we were able to make some progress already. Our mandate allowed for a 2 or 3 day intersessional multi-stakeholder meeting, as it was called, a meeting in New York with representatives from academia, civil society and private sector. Excellent exchange between them and member states. Very helpful, very useful for the report. There is a special report also on this section done by our Singaporean colleagues. But throughout the process, I tried to be, and I said this many times, that I want this process to be transparent and inclusive, also for non-state actors, non-state partners, providing them access to the discussions as much as possible, giving them access to the website of the group, providing them the possibility to send proposals to the website, share them with member states. And I think we made some progress there. We mentioned the importance of civil society in the report, and I hope we were able to pave the way also for better participation of civil society in the future. That, I hope that's more or less what you were expecting. If you have any specific questions or any point I didn't cover sufficiently, I'd be happy to try to respond to that. But thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ambassador Lauber. That's great. Very comprehensive that we can learn very short period of time for the very condensed version what's happening. So perhaps we can have the Q&A later on. Let's move on. The next speaker, which is the Mr. Daniel Dobrygowski, the head of the Governance and Trust, Cybersecurity Legal Counsel of the World Economic Forum in New York. He is essentially an attorney and educator at the intersection of technology. It's very, very rare. Technology, civil rights, law, and policy. He was one of the founding staff members of the Forum of Center for Cybersecurity. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kazuo-san. Thank you for everyone for having us the meeting, for Columbia and Keio for hosting this, and also for Ambassador Lauber and Ambassador Akahori for your remarks in this incredibly vital and obviously geopolitically very sensitive area. And I appreciate the time that we have to speak today. What I'm going to focus on is, I think, some things that are interesting that came out of especially the OEWG process, and that's the focus on multi-stakeholder cooperation such that it could be expressed, as Ambassador Lauber was saying. And I think coming off of the success of these two bodies, the GGE and the OEWG, I think it's important to continue to focus on areas of cooperation, not just between states, but between states and the private sector, between states and civil society, between states and academia and others as well. I think it's also important to kind of take some of the successes we've seen here and maybe broaden some of our thinking about where we can cooperate in this space. So, first, for those not familiar, and I recognize that the World Economic Forum is not something like the UN or the country of Japan that might be a little more commonly known to people, but as far as the World Economic Forum is concerned, we're a Swiss foundation recognized with the status of an international organization for public-private cooperation. And that's through a host state agreement with the Swiss government. So what we do is we work to help create a world where governments, businesses, civil society can work together in innovative ways to create progress that's meant to serve all the people and the planet as a whole. And the forum has a 50-year track record as a non-commercial, independent, impartial platform and a trusted partner of our global stakeholders. We're animated by this recognition that the big challenges of the world can't be solved by governments, business, or civil society acting alone, that these things require a multi-stakeholder approach, just as the OEWG sort of recognized that in their informal and sessional meetings, which were very well attended by a multiplicity of stakeholders. And it was excellent to see that dialogue happen. At the forum, we believe that cooperation, especially public-private cooperation, is essential for shaping our future. And because this future requires us to harness the technologies of what we call the fourth industrial revolution, cybersecurity is absolutely important, both as a responsibility of individual stakeholders and as an issue that requires us all to cooperate at the very highest levels. So building off of what Ambassador Lauber was saying, there's a few things I'd like to highlight for everyone from the OEWG report that just emphasizes how important cooperation can be in this space. If you look at the report itself, for those playing along at home, in paragraph 10, they recognize that the international security dimension of ICT cuts across multiple domains, multiple disciplines, and they explicitly called out the expertise they receive from intergovernmental organizations, from regional organizations, from civil society, from the private sector and academia and the technical community. And I think it's important to recognize the contributions of folks in that space. And again, in paragraph 18 of the OEWG report, they recognize that critical information infrastructure can be owned, managed, and operated by the private sector, which I think for all of us working in the space is an obvious point. And they recognize that cooperation may be necessary to protect the integrity, functioning, and availability of that infrastructure. And I think that recent events have just shown and underlined the importance of that concept. And I think it was excellent to see the OEWG take in input from the private sector into this important sort of norms forming and establishment consensus building process. But I think that one interesting area I'd like to cover is sort of where do we go from here? And maybe that's a good way to open up the conversation. I have a few thoughts. First, obviously, the UN has established its roadmap, and I hope it builds off of the success of the GGE and the effort led by Ambassador Lauber at the OEWG. I think that there's a hopeful note here for both inclusivity and transparency, where a similarly mandated OEWG is going to be extended by the General Assembly to 2025. But I think that there's more that can be done, and I think that things that we can focus on at the state level, ideally, and at the private sector and civil society level, is expanding cooperation even further than it's been already, and also building up concepts around what we call at the forum digital trust. So first, I think there's an opportunity for bigger and better cooperation. We've seen already, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit in the discussion, we've seen things like the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, we've seen the Charter of Trust create spaces where the private sector can cooperate on areas around cybersecurity and their shared goals. We've also seen the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, where it's a clear example of states, private companies, civil society, academic institutions agreeing to work together on a lot of these issues around cybersecurity, around international trust, on a more or less equal footing. And the forum itself, proud signatory of the Paris Call, so we're glad to see that move from consensus toward implementation. And I think that's where a lot of this discussion is headed. And from my perspective, at least, it's important to kind of continue to build cooperation, continue to recognize where equality between stakeholders is important and desirable. You can look at work that's been done back in the 1990s on the governance of technology and law related to technology by people like Larry Lessig, where he defined sort of 4 different areas where we can ensure and shape positive behavior, right? Norms and customs are clearly one, and they impact the others. But there's also law and regulation, there's market incentives, there's the architecture of the software itself. So I think these are all important things to cover as we go forward. And some of these, like norms, have been the purview of states, and that's the focus that we're talking about. But we've seen through the OEWG how cooperation and sharing expertise is important even there, because the holders and developers of a lot of these technologies are in the private sector, and the people who are helping ensure that citizens and regular folks are protected are in civil society and in academia. So I think that there's a good area to focus here. If we take these 4 points and we develop a variety of different models of participation and collaboration around them in order to shore up our work here. And then my final point is around digital trust. I think that this is going to be a vital area that comes out of the discussions around cybersecurity. And if we continue to build up our discussion on cybersecurity, if we can build a framework that ensures security, but also ensures other sort of less tangible aspects of technology use, we'll find that there's a fruitful area for cooperation there. I think, again, the OEWG report points out some areas where we see kind of wider discussions becoming available. In paragraph 16, the OEWG recognizes that non-state actors have demonstrated ICT capabilities previously available only to states. So this is if anything, it's a call to sort of work together, circle the wagons, and recognize that there are other actors here that could be detrimental. The OEWG also, says specifically, and I'll quote this, that states emphasize the positive economic and social opportunities that can be derived from ICTs, and concluded that it's the misuse of such technologies, not the technologies themselves, that is of concern. And here's one area where I would quibble, because I think there's a lot of people out there that recognize that it's also sometimes the technology that's of a concern. And here's where we have a global trust deficit. It's when you see global surveys from the Edelman Trust Survey to the World Values Survey that have shown a significant increase in mistrust of technology and technology users. And that could be a challenge to our ability to innovate. And it should be a wake-up call that we need to ensure that the benefits of technology are more widely available and that tech serves a wider group that has been serving in the future. So it's not just about getting security right. And I recognize that we need to do that, and we need to build up norms and procedures and implementation mechanisms in order to do that. But it's also ensuring that the technologies we're using are trustworthy to the average citizen or user, that they're transparent, that they're not being used to exploit those citizens or they run against our shared values. So I think that we need to cooperate, because digital trust, as we think about it, is an amalgam of a number of different elements. It's a combination of tools for security and rules for how we behave. So we need security and we need secure technologies. We also need to cooperate to ensure accountability, auditability, transparency, the implementation of ethical procedures and processes, and equity in these technology uses. And I think there's no single entity that's an expert on all of these things. No one holds a monopoly on trust. So that's why what we've learned, especially from the OEWG process, and milestones like the Paris Goal, that we need to think more broadly about how we cooperate. And I hope that that's something that kind of down the road, as we think about shaping norms, as we think about shaping how we work with trustworthy technology, that's something that we can begin to focus on. So I'll hand it over to Kazuo for the overall discussion, but thanks for the opportunity to express these views.
Thank you, Daniel.